It comes from the Greek word stigma, meaning mark, tattoo, or brand, used for the identification of a slave. It's first referenced in the New Testament by St. Paul, who claimed to have on his body the marks of Jesus. It speaks to the very origins of Christianity, the suffering of Jesus for the sake of humankind. But are the accounts we have of the stigmata truly supernatural events, or is there something else going on? And how does the Church determine the validity of a particular case? Science meets faith, as we explore the story of the stigmata. Join us as we unlock the mysteries of the Church. It was September 20th, 1918. Padre Pio, a Franciscan living in southern Italy, was ensnarled in the midst of the First World War. He took a moment of quiet to pray for peace in the choir loft of the Church of Our Lady of Grace, when something extraordinary happened. A being appeared to him, one that he had seen before. It was the wounded Christ. For several moments, Christ enveloped Padre Pio's consciousness, filling him with what he later described as a contradiction of suffering and ecstasy. When the encounter was over, Padre Pio was left with the visible wounds of Christ, the stigmata.
The wounds healed the world. That's why we have that prayer. Your sacred wounds, you have healed the world. And there are certain individuals in history who have been selected by God, for reasons known to him, to bear those wounds graphically as a reminder of it. There have been, I think, somewhat, maybe around a little over 40 authenticated instances of this stigmata.
To learn more about this man and this phenomena, we traveled to Bardo, Pennsylvania, the National Padre Pio Center.
The phenomenon of the stigmata has been scrupulously studied by the Church since first learning of it in about the 13th century. Stigmata is a visible representation of the wounds of Christ manifest on a human being. Here, at the home of Padre Pio in the USA, obviously, we're most familiar with the stigmata of Padre Pio. Padre Pio is the only priest in the history of the Catholic Church to bear the stigmata. Originally, when the stigmata manifest on the body of Padre Pio prayed very hard to remove the outward sign. He wished to offer himself as a victim. He wished to suffer in conjunction with Christ for the salvation of souls. When Padre Pio was born, there was nothing unusual about him. In his childhood, he was a bit scrupulous child, but already in his childhood, our Lord had designs on him, and in his childhood, he had already begun living in two worlds, if you will, in our natural world and also in the presence of the supernatural. In the early 1900s, World War I broke out. Padre Pio was drafted into the army. Here he was, a priest with stigmata, serving in the Italian army in the city of Naples. And here, Padre Pio at that time was exposed to the sinfulness of mankind as it was manifesting and unfolding in the 20th century. Padre Pio was dropped in the middle of this controversy of the 20th century because his entire life, his entire being, the physicality of Padre Pio confounded science. He was examined 24/7 without fellow friars or in a room where there were no other types of medication or any type of an instrument that could inflict these wounds. these wounds bled profusely, nonstop, every day for more than 50 years. The blood would flow so much on these particular victim souls that many times they were relieved by going into a deep ecstasy. And when I say relieved, their body, although the blood would be flowing, would not be writhing in pain, but instead, in an ecstasy, their thoughts, their whole entire intellect, as well as their soul, would be united with Christ. And therefore, that type of prayer and that type of offering and victimhood.
And when someone has the stigmata, it's painful. God's gifts involve pain. And it's not just stigmata. Anybody, our Lord says, to those to whom much is given, much from them, much will be required. If somebody is given musical talent, everybody says, "Ooh, I wish I had that." But they don't understand how many hours of agony, or like a ballet dancer, how much agony is involved in using that gift, or the scientist in the laboratory, the artist at his easel, the athlete on the field. All right, you can see somebody winning the Super Bowl, but you don't know all the agony that was involved in it.
I think it's a gift. I think it's just a gift from God, and it's a way of showing others the power of the cross and all the miracles that he performed and still does and is able to transfer it to others.
In the case of Padre Pio, during the holy sacrifice of the Mass, he would sweat profusely in ecstasy during the consecration, and when the friars would go to absorb some of the sweat from his brow, from the side of his face, the purificators would come back soaked with blood and not sweat. So they realized that he was suffering also the crown of thorns.
As Catholics, we have a very sacramental view of the world. That means that God can be revealed in all things and in all creation. And certainly this idea of stigmata, those people that have sort of been officially recognized as stigmatists, is very important. It can even go back to the Apostle Paul, who in his writings mentioned that he has this thorn in his side. As sort of the outward signs of Christ on his own flesh. And so these mysteries of the church, and specifically with the stigmata, I think they're sort of marking points along the way that God is continuing to reveal himself as a way for us to maybe realize that God is still there and God is still active in our lives and in the world.
Think about the stigmata. It's very mysterious. I don't think the person who experiences it can even explain it. But it's also not such an uncommon thing to happen. I mean, we all suffer in our life, and when we suffer, we use those suffering as an opportunity to grow in faith and to go closer to heaven and to be more united with Christ. And so it's not unreasonable or a foreign idea to think that someone might be that united with Christ to suffer in that way. But I can imagine that to the person who had that gift or that miracle, there must be such a spiritual union that somehow the suffering from the stigmata actually does unite them with Christ more than I can even imagine. I think if we step back and take a really big view, for one, we have to believe that a miracle like that, just like any other miracle, is possible, entirely possible.
Those were a reminder for Christians and non-Christians alike of the presence of God in this world, and to what extent he will go to manifest his presence to us. Because for the most part, the wounds that manifest on the body of these stigmatists were not for them, but to call others to them for any reason, whether it was out of curiosity or devotion.
Coming up next, we will go inside the Cloisters Metropolitan Museum to reveal some of the most mysterious and renowned depiction of the crucified Christ. Stay tuned for more Mysteries of the Church.
In St. Francis Church in New York City on 31st Street, where I live, in the entrance of the church, there is a light box with a large stained glass window of Francis. And he has his hands up, and you can see the stigmata. But out of the stigmata is just flowing these rays of light. And it's really a lovely image, but it's like St. Francis being transformed into the light of Christ. And it's what everyone is supposed to experience eventually. That we're so taken up into light that we're transformed by it. One of the things that I think most people don't realize is that no one really saw what was happening when Francis received the stigmata. And it's not really described, and Francis never really talked about it. In fact, this was a major secret that he wanted just to keep sacred. It was between himself and God. And he was afraid to speak about it for fear that he might be violating this. Brother Elias was the general of the order at the time, and in his letter at the death of Christ, he talks about the wounds of Christ. He was like Christ crucified. He talks about holes in his hands. Celano and others who had seen the wounds, he takes this a step further, and he says there were pieces of flesh coming out of the holes that were like these nails and like bent nails. And then there was a wound in the side of Francis that was like a spear wound. These are, as I said, the only descriptions that we have. But a number of witnesses saw these, so we're quite certain that he did have these wounds, and they weren't self-inflicted. His biographers, they're basing themselves on St. Paul when they talk about the marks on his body, but we don't know what St. Paul had or what those marks were. So what you have is Francis is on Mount Alverna in 1224 between the Feast of the Assumption and the Feast of St. Michael the Archangel in September. And then in the middle of this is the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross. And it's around this time that Francis receives the stigmata. And so he must have been meditating on the Gospels, on the readings of the day at this particular time. And it's around this time then that he receives the stigmata. So no one saw it. His companions didn't see it. He didn't talk to them about it. But he had the wounds, and this has been certified by all sorts of witnesses. Now, several Franciscan scholars, in reviewing this and talking about the stigmata, what they'll say is that, well, Francis was a mystic, and this was a mystical experience. What happens is it's almost like the crucifixion is coming from the inside out of the man and is impressing him on his body. So he becomes so identified with the reality of Jesus and the reality of Jesus crucified that even his body becomes a part of this experience.
The gift of the cross is the power, is the knowledge that by loving, self-offering, one conquers pride. Pride brought sin into the world. And therefore, when we conquer pride, life comes into the world. St. Francis had this mystical experience in which he received the wounds, which were a reminder to the world. By our Lord's wounds, we are healed.
And this is where I think the stigmata comes in, is where he's not simply spiritually attuned to Christ, as I think most Christians are in one way or another, but he is so identified with the reality of the Lord that his body is also taken up into this. And this is the whole point, I think, the message of the stigmata, that this human being has been transformed into the reality of Christ by the reality of Christ in his life. And then it connects once again to the Eucharist, which was very important to Francis, that everyone, right, who eats the body and drinks the blood, we are gradually being transformed into the same thing. And this image by Giambono and this image of the glorified Francis in St. Francis, I think depicts wonderfully what we human beings are all called to.
Coming up next, we will go inside the Cloisters Metropolitan Museum to reveal some of the most mysterious and renowned depiction of the crucified Christ. Stay tuned for more Mysteries of the Church.
The cloisters of the Metropolitan Museum of Art has a vast collection of medieval art, and a lot of this art exemplifies the type of meditation that the mendicant orders would lead or try to lead people through to become closer to the reality of Christ by actually drawing them closer to his humanity. That was really the whole point of meditating on these things. It wasn't simply some sort of a gruesome or dwelling on suffering or the suffering of Christ, but rather it really brought out the humanity of Christ, that he is one like us, that he suffers like we do, and he is one with us in our own suffering. And so an extraordinary example at the cloisters is a piece that's called the Lamentation from around 1480 or so. And it's a polychrome walnut carving, and it has Mary holding the Jesus taking down from the cross, and she's surrounded by St. John. In this altarpiece, what you have is Mary holding the body of the Christ that's been taken down from the cross, and she's in extreme agony. And next to her is St. John, and then surrounding her are the other two Marys that we hear about in the Bible, plus Mary Magdalene. And they're all sharing in the sorrow of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, what would have happened is this would have been a perfect example of leading people through a meditation, of looking at each one of the characters in this tableau, and then just trying to empathize and sympathize with what was going on in their hearts and minds, and as a result, drawing closer and closer to the scene. And the whole purpose of this was, again, to open one's heart to the suffering, open one's heart to what the humanity of Jesus had done for us. And by doing that, we then become more receptive to the reality of Jesus. And for instance, like when people received the Eucharist, this was a great preparation for receiving the Eucharist, because the reality of Christ was now being received. But of course, I prepared my heart and my mind and my soul by actually meditating on his journey, through life to the cross. Also, with regard to this, in the cloisters, there's another piece from Germany a little earlier, where you have the Blessed Mother once again holding the body of the dead Jesus. But Jesus is really diminutive in comparison to the monumental size of the Virgin. And what would have happened here is people would have been led through a meditation on what's going on in the scene. And what's going on in the scene is Mary is now remembering that she once held Jesus as a little baby in her arms. And so there's this back and forth between a mother's tender love and care for her child, and now having to lose the child like this. But once again, this would draw people into the reality, the emotions, the humanity of the scenes before them. And in this way, they internally prepare themselves to more fully and decisively receive the reality of Jesus into their own lives. And in this way, I think the Franciscans were continuing not a method, it's certainly a reality that Francis exemplified in his own life.
There were a lot of people hanging on the cross in our time. And I wonder if we have ever thought, with the wounds and fears and tribulations we have, of placing those wounds in the 5 wounds of Jesus Christ each and every day. Oh, we may not be called to the visible stigmata as was Francis of Assisi, but when we surrender the brokenness and place those in his 5 precious wounds, his radiance, his presence, his love can transform us and can make us instruments of his peace. We look at the examples of stigmata, we wonder at those with great reverence. Have we missed the point, though, that what we need to do is to surrender to the divine mercy, to the divine love, to give the fears, the worries, and all of that is negative and wounded, and ask for his help, his strength. We become icons of his presence when we do so, and that can transform the world.